Mikey Biddlestone. I'm a PhD researcher at the University of Kent in the UK, and I research broadly the social motives that predict conspiracy beliefs.
As the primary investigator of the study, could you give us a bit of background on it?
This paper was early on during the pandemic, at least in the UK, so I think we collected the data mid-April 2020, and the idea was kind of forming around mid-March. And the inspiration basically came from this idea that we were kind of seeing a very different response from different countries. We found that a collectivist orientation in a society would seem to be predicting early on this kind of effective approach to responding to the pandemic. So things like people willing to follow guidelines, less kind of disruption politically, this kind of stuff. So we were quite inspired by that, but at the same time there was also this stuff happening in the UK. Personally, I was seeing a lot of, which was the panic buying. So there was some discussion happening at the time about obviously how terrible that was, but also this comparison with some international students I was talking to, where they were saying that that wasn't happening back home, and I was talking to people about why that might be. And we came up with this idea that it was basically probably about how you perceive yourself in a cultural orientation, in the sense of whether you're your own kind of individual autonomous being, or if you define yourself as part of the collective, right, part of the group, that everything you do is kind of for the collective and to help them. What our research found in a nutshell was that individualists, particularly vertical individualists who see hierarchy as justified and okay in society as opposed to everyone should be equal, those people were again more likely to feel powerless, and this in turn was predictive of lower intentions to follow the COVID-19 guidelines. And we also found that belief in COVID-19 conspiracy theories explained this relationship as well, i.e. people who saw themselves as an individual autonomous person were more likely to believe COVID conspiracies, which in turn predicted reduced intentions to follow guidelines. Unsurprisingly, as of course, they may not think that the virus is real, or they may think that the government's lying to them. So, what's the point in following the guidelines when it's not real?
You mentioned in your paper that places like Hong Kong, Taiwan, South Korea did better at successfully suppressing the pandemic, or like controlling it in a way, not suppressing, but controlling, more so than US and Spain, you mentioned in your paper. Why is that?
So the early research, as I've mentioned, was showing at least societal level that societies that had this general higher collectivistic orientation compared to an individualist orientation seem to be handling the pandemic better. So this was what the data was saying, just in a kind of correlational sense. So it suggests that it plays a part in the situation. But I think that might be a bit simplistic. The idea here is that there's this broad theory, which is called the behavioral immune system. And the idea there is that some societies have developed a certain cultural orientation, which makes them more evolutionarily adaptive to things like environmental threats, like a pandemic, or big disasters like a tsunami or something, because of the kind of more the frequency of that happening in certain areas of the world. So there's evidence for and against this theory, but the idea there is that that's what kind of supports the idea that in a collectivistic society that would be adaptive in a high threatening environment, because you need to keep together and help each other to get through this threat and to come up against this threat. But I think there's also kind of more societal historical factors. So of course in China they had a bit of preparation with the SARS virus some years ago, and of course it wasn't on the same level and it didn't spread around the world into a pandemic, but I think there was this kind of they learned from the process a bit, I think, in terms of how they would respond and how they would treat it in terms of virology, but also in terms of behavior and laws in society. That being said, of course, there were mistakes made and some cover-ups, is what the evidence is saying, in terms of where they tried to stop the spread of the information of the fact that the virus was a new virus, that it was COVID-19.
Why do people believe in these COVID conspiracy theories?
The general psychological literature supports the notion that basically conspiracy beliefs may stem from this frustration of basic needs. So these needs are broadly defined as existential needs. So these are things where you need security in your environment and to feel safe. There's also epistemic needs. So this is to kind of make sense of your environment and reduce uncertainty in order to predict the future and again stay safe. And then there's these social or relational needs, which are these things about the groups that you belong to, kind of defending your group by using conspiracy theories. So from the research so far as well with the COVID-19 pandemic, this seems to map onto this framework quite well. So basically, there's this existential threat of COVID-19 where people don't really know what their life is going to mean now. They've got to stay indoors where they're lonely all the time. They're alone with their thoughts. At the same time, there's this element of nationalism to it. So for example, protecting the identity of your nation. So in that sense, the general framework in psychology kind of really maps onto the COVID conspiracies very well. But in our paper as well, we've kind of added this element of perhaps, these motives don't just act in a vacuum or by themselves. There are also these more dispositional characteristics that we have, such as cultural orientation. With our paper, basically, as I've mentioned, it was kind of early on in the pandemic. It was in April. So we really had this kind of blanket approach to collecting these ideas and conspiracy theories. So we used Reddit and a lot of news stories that were reporting on the kind of online groups that were basically, we were getting sentiments of, what these conspiracy theories were, what the flavors of them were, and that kind of thing. So what we found was there was quite a big variation in the outgroups that they were selecting, right? So there was this one that the US had deliberately brought it to China, but also there were ones that China had deliberately released it on the population, and the kind of motives that were assumed behind these were about damaging the outgroup nation, that kind of thing. And then the second important one I think that we selected was that the implementation of 5G technology is a means of deliberately spreading coronavirus. So this was this kind of general aspect of these many different 5G conspiracies that were that seemed to be spreading at the time. And the reason why we chose that wasn't just because people seemed to be believing them, it was because this was definitely being deliberately pushed, not just by kind of Russian misinformation bots and with coordinations with other nations. This was also being pushed by David Icke. And we had this kind of specific interest in what we kind of refer to as conspiracist entrepreneurs or conspiracy entrepreneurs. And, of course, these are people that make a lot of money off of spreading these conspiracy theories. So at the time, David Icke had been, his video had been taken down off of YouTube, where he'd been interviewed about how 5G is, going to change our brains, change our biology, this kind of stuff.
How have these conspiracy theories diminished or undermined the effort to stop the spread of COVID-19?
So I really like this question because it's still ongoing, the research, on what the consequences are essentially of these conspiracy theories and how that's happened. But what we know is that is conspiracy theories really reduce your intentions in trusting government, right? So anything that the government says that's supposed to be good for us, taking our medicine, that kind of thing, is just disregarded as nothingness, not worth considering. So in that sense, it reduces compliance with authority. But I think there's more to it with the pandemic that's really come out, which is that it's really homogenized a lot of very varied conspiracy groups or kind of ideological groups to the point where they're quite a varied large group now that do engage in collective action, like they go and protest, in London against the lockdown and this kind of thing. And if you look on their online communities, you can really see there's a lot of diverse opinions on there, but they tend to identify based on this kind of higher up identity, which is that they don't agree with the government. The government is imposing this authoritarian thing on them because they're making them wear a piece of cloth on their face. It's the worst thing that's ever happened to them. But that kind of bringing together of diversity, I think, is really interesting in the pandemic, which is that that's really made people feel galvanized and justified in their conspiracy beliefs, and therefore the kind of results of them or outcomes or consequences are much stronger because they feel more confident in the fact that there's more of them in this kind of superordinate identity. And I think that the kind of social or relational consequences in the pandemic have been really clear. So, of course, we've all been isolated, been lonely. We know that leads to conspiracy beliefs for different reasons, including this kind of existential worry of loneliness, but also this kind of feeling of boredom. When you're bored, you haven't got something else to do. You're not putting your mind to something. You're kind of vulnerable to these sorts of kind of romantic or fun ideas really taking hold and being internalized in your head, and I think that that kind of loneliness and boredom really adds to that, and essentially I think that the Pandora's box has been opened, unfortunately, in the sense that it's already kind of been practiced for kind of the spread of misinformation purposefully, and it's been quite effective, the use of bots and this kind of stuff. So the reason I say the Pandora's box has been opened is because I don't think you can close that. It's already been being developed and added to, and what I think we need to focus on, instead of looking at it as this surface level problem, which is that the ideas are the issue. Of course, the ideas are harmful. They can be prejudiced. They can be, they can create disruption in society and harm to people. I think the main thing is to look deeper into people's psychology, and basically, a lot of this seems to come from systemic issues. Things like reduced well-being, again, feelings of existential dread that come from inequality, social deprivation, relative deprivation, all this kind of stuff. So if we look at it as this kind of social illness, rather than the fact that these ideas are ridiculous or dumb, it's not about that. It's an ideology that stems from a frustration of needs and a frustration with your circumstances and your environment and society. So in that sense, we really need to look into making people happier.